On a rainy Thursday evening, my son looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're too stupid to understand how the world works." The words didn't just fall into the silence, they detonated in it. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Surely my own child, the boy I had carried, raised, and sacrificed for, couldn't mean it. But the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes didn't flinch, told me he did. I had been correcting him on a simple fact about our family's history, the kind of detail I'd always remembered better than anyone else. We were in the middle of dinner. The steam from the mashed potatoes curled in the air, mingling with the smell of roasted chicken. A quiet, ordinary moment. Then, as if something inside him snapped, he dismissed me with those 7 poisoned words. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I could feel my heart pounding, my palms going cold. Across the table, his wife gave an awkward laugh, as if to smooth things over. My younger daughter lowered her gaze, pretending to be absorbed in her plate. But no one said anything to stop him. That was the worst part. Not just his insult, but the silence that followed. The silence that said, maybe they all agreed. I forced a small smile, the kind you give when you're trying not to cry, and continued eating. I didn't trust my voice. If I spoke, I knew it would break, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. The rest of dinner dragged on like a punishment. My mind kept circling back to his face, the condescension in his tone, the way he seemed almost proud of putting me down. My son, my pride, my brightest hope, now looking at me as if I were a burden, an embarrassment, and somewhere deep inside, a painful truth whispered, "This isn't the first time he's made you feel small. It's just the first time you can't pretend it didn't happen." That night, as I washed the dishes alone, the house felt colder than the rain outside. I could still hear his voice, sharp, dismissive, final. And with every plate I scrubbed, I felt something hardening inside me. He thought I wasn't smart enough. He had no idea what I was capable of. Friends, let's take a short pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? And if you can, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone. That's how you help us grow and keep bringing you these emotional stories every day. All right, let's continue. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was pulled backward, not just to the dinner table, but far deeper, to years I had tried to bury under layers of chores, obligations, and polite smiles. I saw the small wooden house where I grew up. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked when it rained, and the cold seemed to live inside the walls. My father worked odd jobs that never lasted, and my mother cleaned other people's homes to keep bread on our table. Education was never the center of our lives. Survival was. I remember the smell of damp clothes hanging too close to the stove, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, and the way hunger made everything feel heavier. School was my escape. I loved the smell of new books, the crisp sound of chalk against the blackboard, the strange comfort of numbers and words that obeyed rules, unlike the chaos of our life. Teachers told me I had potential, that I could go far if I studied hard, and for a while I believed them. But dreams don't always survive reality. At 17, I married. Not out of romance, but because it felt like the only door open to me. My husband had steady work at the time, and the idea of stability was seductive. Within a year, I was pregnant. Then another child came, and another. College brochures I once hid under my pillow were thrown away to make space for baby bottles. My world shrank to the walls of our kitchen, the hum of the washing machine, the steady rhythm of preparing meals and folding laundry. There were moments, especially in those early years, when I caught myself wondering what might have been if I'd held on to my education. But those thoughts felt dangerous, selfish even. I told myself that being a good mother meant giving all of myself to my family. And I did. Completely. Still, there was always that quiet ache, a shadow in the corner of my mind, a constant whispering reminder that I had stopped growing the moment I said I do. Every time someone at a gathering mentioned college life, or quoted a book I hadn't read, or used a word I didn't know, the ache sharpened. I smiled and nodded, pretending I understood. Inside, I felt smaller, and now, years later, my own son's words had ripped the scar wide open, too stupid to understand. He had no idea that my so-called ignorance was bought with his childhood. The nights I stayed up sewing clothes for him, the meals I skipped so he could have seconds, the quiet sacrifices no one clapped for. It wasn't just his insult that hurt. It was the way it echoed every unspoken judgment I had felt my whole life. Every look that said you don't belong here. Every moment I swallowed my own voice because I didn't think it mattered. That night, standing at the sink, I realized something that chilled me more than the rain outside. I had let the world convince me I was less, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to prove everyone wrong. The years blurred together in a quiet, predictable rhythm. Mornings began before the sun was fully awake. The smell of coffee brewing, the hiss of an iron pressing shirts, the clink of plates set out for breakfast. My life revolved around the needs of others. My husband's career required long hours and frequent travel, and I made sure his shirts were always crisp, his bags packed, his favorite meals waiting when he came home. I learned to anticipate his moods before he spoke a word. When the children were small, my days were filled with their noise, the soft thud of little feet racing down the hall, the endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, comforting, teaching. I took pride in being the anchor, the one who kept the family steady while everyone else chased their ambitions. I told myself it was enough, that the measure of my worth was how well they thrived. I was there for every science fair, every football game, every late-night study session. I clapped the loudest, smiled the brightest, and swallowed the envy that sometimes rose when I saw other women pursuing careers, traveling, achieving things I once dreamed of. I became a master at hiding that part of me, the restless, aching part that wondered if I had traded too much of myself away. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when the light would catch me unexpectedly. A neighbor would say I had a talent for storytelling after I recounted some piece of local history. A teacher would compliment my insight at a parent-teacher meeting, but these moments were small candles, quickly blown out by the draft of everyday life. I learned to make my presence invisible, to blend into the background of their lives so seamlessly that no one stopped to consider how much I was holding together. My husband's promotions were celebrated with dinners out, speeches, toasts. My son's academic awards filled our living room shelves. My daughter's performances drew applause and flowers. And me? My accomplishments existed in the invisible margins. The birthday cakes baked from scratch, the bills paid on time, the quiet comfort offered when someone's world fell apart. There's a loneliness in being the foundation. People stand on you, build on you, live because you hold them up, but they rarely look down to see you. And over time, you begin to wonder if you are even there at all. I became so practiced in smiling through my own disappointment that I almost believed it wasn't there. But deep down there was always the knowledge that I was living in the shadows of the people I loved. I had built them into towers while keeping myself in the dark, and I didn't resent them for it. Not exactly, I just forgot what it felt like to stand in the light. The night my son called me stupid, it wasn't just an insult, it was a confirmation of something I had long feared, that my sacrifices had made me invisible, even to the very people I gave everything for. And invisibility, I realized, can be more painful than any wound. From the moment he was born, my son carried my dreams inside him. I remember holding him for the first time, tracing the tiny lines of his fingers, whispering silent promises into the soft crown of his head. I would give him the life I never had. I would open doors for him that had always been closed to me. I would make sure he never felt small the way I had felt small. I poured myself into him. I stayed up late quizzing him for exams, hunted down scholarships, saved every extra penny for his books and tuition. When he walked across the stage at his high school graduation, wearing that cap and gown, my throat tightened with pride so fierce it felt like it might break me. That day, the applause felt like it was for both of us. For him, for what he had achieved, and for me, for making it possible. University changed him. At first, it was little things. The new words he used, the way he started correcting me more often. I told myself it was normal. He was learning, growing, expanding his mind. But over time, the corrections turned into condescension, the conversations into lectures. When he came home for the holidays, he seemed impatient, distracted, like my stories were background noise to his important life. Then came the career. a good job, a salary that dwarfed anything his father and I had ever earned. I celebrated him, bragged to neighbors, clipped every article that mentioned his name. But with each success, there was a shift, a subtle tilt in the way he looked at me. It was no longer the gaze of a son looking at his mother with gratitude or affection. It was the gaze of someone looking down, measuring, finding you lacking. I noticed it at dinners when he spoke more to others than to me, when he explained simple concepts as though I were a child, when he introduced me to colleagues with a quick, "This is my mom," and nothing more. No mention of the sacrifices, the history, the love that built him. Pride and pain lived side by side in me, battling in silence. I wanted to cling to the joy of his achievements, to remember the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and wide eyes, seeking comfort. But that boy had grown into a man who seemed to believe he was made entirely by his own hands. The night he called me stupid wasn't born in a single moment. It was the culmination of years of small dismissals, of my voice being pushed to the edges of his world. That sentence, sharp, careless, was only the spark that lit the fire already smoldering inside me. And as I lay awake in the dark, I felt the strange weight of a truth I didn't want to face. Somewhere along the way, my son had stopped seeing me as the woman who built his life. He had started seeing me as someone who didn't deserve to stand beside him at all. It happened so gradually that at first I didn't even notice. One day I realized my son no longer called to share his news. Once he used to tell me everything, a new project at work, a promotion on the horizon, even the details of a trip he was planning. I lived for those conversations, feeling like I was still part of his world, even if I couldn't walk the same path he did. But slowly, the calls became shorter, the updates fewer, and eventually I learned about his life the same way strangers did, through social media posts and secondhand whispers. I would see a photo online, him smiling in a crisp suit beside people I had never met, holding a glass of champagne, his arm around colleagues who looked at him with admiration. I would scroll through the comments. "Congratulations! So proud of you!" and feel the sting of not having been there, not having been invited. My son was building a life full of milestones, and I was not part of the guest list. The first time I felt the shame cut deep was at a charity dinner. I had been invited through a mutual acquaintance, not by him. I spotted him across the room, standing tall among a group of well-dressed professionals. I started to walk over, my heart warm with the thought of surprising him. But as I approached, he caught sight of me, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't joy or even mild surprise. It was discomfort. He stepped toward me quickly, his hand lightly touching my arm, his voice low as he said something about it being a work thing, and maybe I'd feel out of place. He smiled for the benefit of those around us, but I felt the weight of what he really meant. You don't belong here. After that night, I began to notice more. How he never mentioned me when he spoke about his life to others, how he avoided introducing me to people whose approval seemed important to him, how I only learned about his biggest achievements when they were already old news. There were weddings, business trips, awards, all things I found out about too late to be part of. I told myself I was imagining it, that he was simply busy, but deep down I knew better. It wasn't just that he was keeping things from me. It was that he was curating his world, choosing what and who fit the image he wanted to present. And I, his own mother, no longer fit. I kept smiling when I saw him, kept asking questions I already knew he wouldn't answer fully. I learned to nod and pretend the distance didn't hurt. But inside, a slow, invisible resentment began to take root. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that grows quietly, feeding on every moment of exclusion. Because the truth was he wasn't just shutting me out of his life. He was erasing me from the story of who he had become. It was supposed to be a warm evening, the kind of gathering where family comes together over a big table, where the smell of roasted meat and baked bread fills the air, where stories flow as easily as the wine. I had spent the day preparing dishes I knew everyone loved, moving from stove to sink to counter in a practiced rhythm. By the time the guests arrived, I was tired but happy, the way a host is when her work is rewarded with laughter and full plates. The conversation drifted from work updates to childhood memories. I listened quietly, smiling at the younger ones, arguing over who had been the most mischievous growing up. Then my son began telling a story, one I had told countless times before, about how our family had settled in this town generations ago, but he told it differently, with little smirks, twisting details for laughs. And then with a quick glance at me, he added, "Well, you know Mom, our resident home historian. She knows everything, except she never actually studied history. No diploma, just the kitchen table university." The words landed like a slap. There was a ripple of laughter around the table. Not cruel, but easy, careless, the kind people share when they think the joke is harmless. I forced a tight smile, my hands gripping the edge of my chair so hard my knuckles ached. I could feel heat rising to my face, but not from embarrassment alone. It was something sharper, humiliation laced with anger. They didn't see the way my chest tightened, how every beat of my heart seemed to echo in my ears. They didn't know that behind that little home historian joke was a lifetime of sacrifices, of nights spent reading by lamplight when the children were asleep, of facts and dates I had stored in my mind because learning had been my one private joy. They didn't see that what he meant wasn't just a joke about my lack of a diploma. It was a reminder, in front of everyone, that I didn't belong in the world of the educated, the accomplished. I excused myself quietly. No one tried to stop me. The laughter rolled on behind me as I walked to the back room. The moment I closed the door, the noise faded, replaced by the sound of my own unsteady breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling in my lap, and bit down hard on my lip to keep the tears from spilling. I had endured so many small cuts over the years, moments of being overlooked, of being patronized, of being left out. But this felt different. This was public. This was my son telling the whole family, in his polished, charming way, that I was someone to be smiled at, indulged, but never truly respected. That night, as I cleared the dishes after everyone left, I moved slowly, deliberately, as if each plate I stacked was a thought I was putting in order. Something inside me shifted. I wasn't sure yet what it meant, but I knew one thing. The part of me that had accepted living in the shadows was starting to stir. And once it woke fully, it would not go back to sleep. It was a bitter winter afternoon, the kind where the cold doesn't just sting your skin, it seeps into your bones. I had been walking home from the market, clutching a small bag of groceries, when the wind picked up and the snow began to fall in heavy, wet flakes. My gloves were thin, my cheeks raw from the wind, and I knew I wouldn't make it home without stopping somewhere warm. The library was just ahead, a place I had passed countless times but rarely entered. I pushed the heavy glass door open, and the sudden warmth wrapped around me like a blanket. The smell of old paper and polished wood filled the air, familiar and comforting in a way I hadn't expected. I brushed the snow from my coat and stepped inside, not intending to stay long, just long enough to thaw my fingers. I wandered between the shelves, letting my hand trail along the spines of books. History, biographies, memoirs. Rows upon rows of lives and events captured and preserved. I felt the same quiet pull I'd felt as a girl in school, the sense that here, among these pages, was a world I belonged to. I settled into a corner with a book about local history, flipping through the pages as the minutes slipped by. That's when I heard a voice, warm, curious, asking if the seat beside me was free. I looked up to see a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a tweed jacket, holding a stack of books. I nodded and he sat down, glancing at the title in my hands. "That's a good one," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew. I helped write a few chapters in that. We began to talk. It started with the book, then drifted to the stories I knew, the ones passed down in my family, the bits of history I'd memorized and guarded over the years. I told him about the old houses in town, the names carved into headstones, the traditions fading from memory. His eyes lit up as I spoke, and for once I didn't feel the need to hold back or downplay what I knew. When I mentioned that I'd never studied formally, he didn't smirk or dismiss me. Instead, he leaned forward. "That doesn't make your knowledge any less valuable," he said. In fact, it might make it more alive. You've lived it. You've carried it. I learned he was a professor at the local university, specializing in cultural history. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, taking notes on the names and dates I recited from memory. The more we talked, the more something long dormant inside me began to stir. That old hunger to learn, to be taken seriously, to matter beyond the walls of my home. When he finally stood to leave, he handed me his card. "You should come by the university sometime," he said. "You have something important to share, and I think others would want to hear it." I slipped the card into my coat pocket, unsure if I'd ever use it. But as I stepped back into the cold evening, the snow crunching beneath my boots, I realized I felt warmer than when I'd walked in. Not because of the library's heat, but because for the first time in years, someone had looked at me and seen more than a mother, more than a shadow. They had seen a woman who had something worth saying. A week passed before I found the professor's card again. It was still in the pocket of my winter coat, the edges softened from being bent, the ink slightly smudged. I held it for a long time, running my thumb over the raised letters of his name, wondering if he'd meant what he said, or if it had just been polite conversation between strangers in a library. I almost put it back, telling myself I had no business calling. But something about that meeting lingered. The way he had listened to me. Really listened, without that thin veil of condescension I'd grown so used to. On an impulse I barely understood, I dialed the number. He remembered me instantly. His voice was warm, and before I could lose my nerve, he told me there was something he wanted to ask. The university was hosting a series of talks on local history, not the kind you find in textbooks, but the kind passed down in kitchens, whispered on front porches, kept alive in the memories of families. He thought my knowledge could be the perfect opening lecture. The words caught me off guard. Me? Speaking in front of university students? My first reaction was to laugh nervously and tell him he must be mistaken. I had no credentials, no degrees, no reason to stand in front of people who had studied this subject for years. What if they asked questions I couldn't answer? What if they saw me as nothing more than a housewife, pretending to be something she wasn't? I told him I wasn't the right person. He didn't argue, just said, "Think about it, your stories are living history. If you don't tell them, they might vanish." For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake those words. I thought of the family tales my grandmother had whispered to me, the names of people long gone that I still carried like treasures in my mind, the little truths about our town that never made it into books. And then I thought of my son, of that night at the dinner table, of the way his words had sliced through me, too stupid to understand. The memory burned, but it also lit something in me. The next morning I called the professor back. My voice trembled as I told him I would do it. He sounded pleased but not surprised, as if he had known I would come around. He gave me the date and time, and I wrote them down in my kitchen notebook, the same one I used for grocery lists and family birthdays. But this time, what I was writing was mine, not anyone else's. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I had no idea how I would stand in front of a room full of strangers and speak, but for the first time in a long time I wasn't thinking about what I lacked. I was thinking about what I had to give, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The day of the lecture arrived faster than I expected. For a week I had lived in a haze of preparation, writing notes, crossing them out, rewriting them again. I practiced aloud in my kitchen while stirring soup, in front of the mirror while folding laundry, even quietly to myself while walking to the market. No matter how much I rehearsed, a voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that I didn't belong there, that the students would see through me, that they would hear my words and think, "She's nothing more than a housewife playing scholar." That morning I stood in front of my wardrobe, paralyzed. What did one wear to speak at a university? I settled on a simple navy dress I had owned for years, pressing it carefully, smoothing the fabric until not a single wrinkle remained. I pinned my hair back the way my mother used to for important occasions, a quiet nod to the woman who first taught me the stories I was about to share. The campus felt like another world. The stone buildings, the echo of footsteps in long hallways, the smell of books and polished floors. My heart was pounding so loudly I could feel it in my throat as the professor greeted me with a warm smile and guided me to the lecture hall. The room was full. Students leaned over notebooks and laptops, their conversations low and quick. I gripped the sides of the podium, my palms damp, and for a split second I wanted to turn and run. But then I saw a girl in the front row. She couldn't have been more than 20, looking at me with an open, curious expression. It reminded me of how I used to look at my teachers when I was her age. And suddenly, I didn't want to let her down. I began speaking softly, my voice shaky at first, telling them about the old farms that once stood where their apartment blocks now rose, about the families who had built this town from nothing, about the traditions that had shaped the way people here lived, loved, and mourned. As the words flowed, my fear began to loosen its grip. I stopped looking at my notes. I told the stories the way they had been told to me, with pauses in the right places, with the small details that make history feel alive. The room grew still. Students leaned forward, pens hovering in midair, not writing, just listening. Some smiled at the humorous details, others' eyes softened at the sad parts. By the time I finished, the silence was thick, not the awkward kind, but the kind that holds something sacred. Then came the applause. It started politely, then swelled until it filled the room. I felt heat rush to my face, but this time it wasn't from shame. Afterward, the professor approached me with a look of genuine admiration. "You have a gift," he said simply. "I'd like you to consider doing more of these. There's so much you can share, and they're eager to hear it." I walked out of that building into the cold winter air, my breath visible in front of me, my heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just the woman in the background, holding others up. I was standing in my own light, and it felt like the beginning of something I hadn't dared hope for in a very long time. I didn't tell anyone at home what I was doing. Not my husband, not my daughter, and certainly not my son. The lectures became my private world, a door I could slip through where no one interrupted me with grocery lists or laundry requests, where no one measured my worth in meals cooked or errands run. After that first talk, the professor invited me back. I agreed, and then again and again. Each time I dug deeper into the past, my past, our town's past, the fragile threads of memory that connected generations. I visited the archives at the library, tracing my finger over brittle pages and faded ink. I walked through old neighborhoods with my notebook in hand, jotting down the stories of the few elders still willing to tell them. Sometimes they spoke for hours, their voices trembling, their eyes far away. I listened as though I were collecting pieces of a puzzle only I could put together. At night, when the house was quiet and the dishes were done, I sat at the kitchen table with stacks of notes, shaping them into something that felt like more than just recollection, something that might last. I learned how to structure an article, how to cite sources, how to make my words both truthful and compelling. The professor helped me polish them, and slowly my work began to appear in small local journals. I didn't sign my full name at first, just my initials. It was like testing the water without letting the world see me dive in. The more I worked, the more I felt a quiet strength building inside me. This wasn't about proving my son wrong, not entirely. It was about proving to myself that I had always been more than the roles I had been given. That the girl who once loved school, who soaked up knowledge like sunlight, had not disappeared. She had only been buried under years of service to everyone but herself. There were moments of guilt, times when I'd skip baking a pie for Sunday dinner because I was chasing down a lead on a story, or when I'd answer a family question with absent-minded nods because my head was still in the archives. But the guilt never outweighed the exhilaration. For the first time in decades, I was doing something that belonged only to me. I kept everything quiet because I wasn't ready to share it. Not until I had something undeniable. Something that no one, not even my own son, could diminish with a careless joke. And with every page I filled, every interview I recorded, I felt the slow, steady rise of a woman who was no longer content to live in the shadows. It was late afternoon when the phone rang. The kind of winter day when the light fades early and the house feels suspended in a soft, gray hush. I was at the kitchen table, surrounded by open notebooks, a half-empty cup of tea gone cold beside me. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in my chest tightened as I picked up. It was the professor. His voice was warmer than usual, carrying a note of restrained excitement. He didn't waste time on small talk. "I have some news," he said, "and I wanted you to hear it from me first." I held my breath without realizing it, the pen in my hand frozen over the page. "The university has reviewed your work, the lectures, the published pieces, the interviews you've preserved. They've decided to honor you with a degree, an honorary doctorate, in recognition of your contribution to preserving our region's cultural heritage." For a moment I thought I had misheard him. A degree. Me. The word felt too big, too heavy, too impossible to belong in my life. It was the thing I had given up before I even had the chance to chase it, the dream I had folded away and hidden like a fragile dress in a box, telling myself I would never wear it. And now it was being handed to me. Not as pity, not as a courtesy, but as acknowledgement. My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, to thank him, to ask if he was sure. But the words tangled together, useless. The professor's voice softened. "You earned this," he said. "Every bit of it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After we hung up, I just sat there, the silence of the room pressing in. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what this meant. I thought of the countless nights I had spent in this very kitchen, folding laundry while my son studied for his exams, making sure his dreams had every chance to grow, even as mine were left in the dark. I thought of the library, the shelves, the cold afternoon when I first met the man who had seen me. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who believed she could learn anything, be anything. And then I thought of the dinner table, the sharp words, the laughter at my expense, too stupid to understand. A slow, steady warmth spread through me. This wasn't just an award. This was proof. Not for the world, not even for my son, but for me, that I had never been what they thought I was. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine walking into a room not as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone in the background, but as a woman who had built something of her own. And the image didn't feel like a dream anymore. It felt like a promise. The morning of the ceremony felt unreal, as if I were moving through a dream I wasn't quite convinced I deserved. My hands shook as I dressed, the rich, heavy fabric of the academic gown draping over my shoulders like something borrowed from another life. The deep colors, the velvet trim, the unfamiliar weight of it. It felt ceremonial, almost sacred. I caught my reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized the woman staring back. There was a steadiness in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. The university auditorium was filled to the brim. Rows of polished seats stretched out under the soft glow of the overhead lights, the air buzzing with the hum of voices. Faculty in their own regalia lined the stage, the smell of flowers from the arrangements drifting up from the floor. Somewhere beyond the bright stage lights, my family was seated together. I knew they were there, my husband, my daughter, and my son. The thought made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't name. When my name was announced, the sound of applause rose and swelled, filling every corner of the hall. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. A sea of clapping hands, the clicking of cameras, the faint hum of a video recorder catching it all. My feet felt strangely light as I walked toward the podium, yet each step seemed to echo in my chest. I could see them now. My family in the third row leaning forward. My son's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on me. I remembered the last time we'd been in a room together, where all eyes were on him, how proud I had felt watching him succeed. And now, the gaze was mine. The chancellor placed the doctoral hood over my shoulders, with a gentle, deliberate motion. It felt like a crown, not the kind given by birthright, but the kind earned through years of quiet, unseen labor. The applause grew louder, rolling through the room in waves. I felt it in my bones. I took my place at the lectern. For a moment, I just stood there, my fingers resting on the smooth wood, letting the sound wash over me. I thought about every step that had led me here, the sacrifices, the silences, the insults I'd swallowed whole. And now, standing under the lights, wearing the colors of scholarship, I understood something. This moment wasn't the erasure of those years, it was the transformation of them. I began to speak, my voice steady despite the swell of emotion threatening to break it. Faces blurred in the brightness, but I could still make out my son in the crowd. I watched him watching me. No smirk, no dismissal, just a stillness that made me think he was seeing me differently for the first time in a very long time. When I finished, the hall erupted again in applause. It was no longer the polite clapping that greets a speaker. It was something warmer, something that carried the weight of acknowledgement. The cameras kept flashing, the air thick with the sound of people rising to their feet. In that moment, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen entirely. The applause was still echoing when my eyes found his again. My son sat frozen in his seat, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture suddenly different. Not the confident, assured stance I had grown used to, but something quieter, more uncertain. The color had drained from his face, and for a moment he looked almost like the boy I once knew, the one who used to reach for my hand in crowded rooms. The room around us seemed to fade. I couldn't hear the cameras anymore, couldn't see the rows of strangers standing on their feet. All I could see was him, staring at me as though trying to reconcile the woman before him with the mother he thought he knew. His gaze held questions I had waited years for him to ask without words. How did I not see this in you? How much of you have I ignored? What else have I been wrong about? I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. What I felt was heavier and more complex, the deep, grounding weight of justice finally settling into place. This wasn't about humiliating him or proving him small. It was about standing in my own truth so completely that he had no choice but to see it. And now he did. His eyes flickered, and I caught the first glimmer of something else. Shame. Not the kind born from being caught in a mistake, but the kind that comes when a mirror is suddenly held up, and you see the unkindness you've carried for too long. The kind that forces you to remember the words you can never take back. In that stillness between us, I thought of every moment he had looked past me, every time he had spoken down to me, every milestone I had quietly celebrated from the sidelines because I wasn't invited to stand beside him. And now here he was, sitting among hundreds, watching me be honored for something he never imagined I was capable of. For the first time in decades, I felt no need to defend myself, no hunger for his approval. I didn't need it anymore. The recognition I had longed for had already been given, not just by the university but by life itself. I was no longer the invisible woman in his shadow. I was the woman in the light, and whether he wanted to or not, he had to see it. I held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, letting the silence speak all the words I could have said. And then, slowly, I allowed my eyes to move past him, to the rest of the hall, to the hundreds of other faces smiling back at me, because this moment was mine, entirely mine. I stood at the lectern for a long moment, letting the applause settle into a hush. The air felt thick with expectation, hundreds of eyes fixed on me, the weight of the doctoral hood resting warmly on my shoulders. I could hear my own breath in the microphone, the faint rustle of programs in the audience. When I began to speak, my voice was quiet, but steady. People often think education is something you receive once, a diploma, a certificate, a title, something you hang on the wall to prove you've learned enough to matter. I paused, letting the words settle. But I've learned something else. Education isn't just a piece of paper. It's not bound by walls or by age. Education is a path we choose every single day, in the questions we ask, the stories we listen to, the truth we seek, and the humility to admit there's always more to learn. A few faces in the front row softened. I saw hands come together in quiet applause before I'd even finished. I went on, speaking not from the notes I had prepared, but from somewhere deeper. I never had the chance to go to university when I was young. Life had other plans for me. But life also gave me a different kind of classroom. The kitchen table where my grandmother told me our family's history, the quiet moments listening to elders speak about what they'd lived through, the hours spent in libraries holding the past in my hands. Every story I've carried, every memory I've preserved has been my education. And today, you've told me it matters. My throat tightened, but I didn't look down. I wanted them to see my eyes. If there's one thing I hope you remember, it's this. You are never too small, too old, or too late to learn, and you are never unworthy of standing in the light. The silence after those words was brief, but it felt endless. And then the sound came. Applause so loud it seemed to shake the air, people rising to their feet, some wiping their eyes. The wave of it rolled toward me, and for a heartbeat I had to close my eyes just to keep the tears from spilling. When I opened them again, I saw the professor smiling with quiet pride. I saw students clapping until their hands turned red. I saw strangers who didn't know me at all, looking at me as if they did. And in the third row, I saw my son, standing with the rest of them, his expression unreadable but his eyes glistening. It wasn't just approval, it was acknowledgement. And that, more than anything, was what I'd been searching for all along. The ceremony slowly dissolved into the soft murmur of conversations, the shuffle of feet, and the rustle of coats being gathered. People approached me one after another. Students, professors, strangers who had heard me speak, each with kind words, warm smiles, and firm handshakes. Their faces blurred together, but their voices all carried the same message, that my work had value, that my presence mattered, that I had earned my place on that stage. Through it all, I kept catching glimpses of my family standing off to the side, my husband's familiar, steady smile, my daughter's bright, tearful eyes, and my son, tall, still, watching me with an intensity I couldn't quite read. It was as if he was trying to reconcile two versions of me in his mind, the mother who had packed his lunches and washed his clothes, and the woman who had just been honored by a university for her contribution to history. When the crowd began to thin, he finally stepped forward. The noise of the room seemed to fade until all I could hear was the echo of his shoes against the polished floor. He didn't look like the confident, polished man I'd grown used to seeing, the one who filled rooms with his voice and his certainty. He looked younger somehow, quieter, his shoulders not quite as square. He stopped in front of me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he took a breath, as if steadying himself, and stepped closer. His arms went around me, not the quick, distracted hug he'd given so many times before, but something longer, warmer, with a weight to it that seemed to anchor both of us. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I heard every word. "Mama, I was wrong." The world seemed to still. Those 4 words sank deep, past all the years of silence, the small dismissals, the unspoken judgments. They reached the part of me that had been carrying the weight of his disapproval for so long, the part that had ached to be seen not just as the woman who raised him, but as a person in her own right. I didn't cry, though the sting was there in my eyes. Instead, I rested my hand against the back of his head the way I had when he was a boy, and felt the steadiness of my own breath. In that moment, I didn't need him to say anything else. It wasn't about erasing the past. Nothing could do that. It was about the shift, the recognition, the simple truth that now lived between us. He saw me. And it wasn't just him. I could feel it in the way people had looked at me today, in the applause that had filled the hall, in the way the professor had placed the hood on my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just someone's mother or someone's wife. I was a woman who had earned respect not through the roles I had been given, but through the work I had chosen, the voice I had claimed, the knowledge I had fought to preserve. As we walked out into the cold evening, my son kept close beside me, his hand brushing mine as though afraid to let the distance grow again. The air was sharp, our breath rising in white clouds, but inside I felt a steady warmth, the kind that doesn't fade with the season. I knew the road ahead would be different now, not because the world had suddenly changed, but because I had. I had stepped into my own light, and I wasn't going back into the shadows.